Hotep, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. What we're going to talk about today is the real reason that Christians were persecuted. You know, in a society where the majority of people adhere to the Abrahamic faiths, be it Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, the majority of people are aware of the narrative that Christians, especially in the first, second, and third centuries, following the death of Christ, were persecuted. They were made as martyrs. They were beheaded. They were burned at the stake. They were hunted down and killed, and basically they suffered an enormous amount of atrocities. You can find references to these atrocities not only in the Christian Bible, but also in sources that we will look at shortly, as like Pliny the Younger in his letters to the Emperor Trajan, and also in Tacitus, a Roman historian. But what I've found is most people aren't really aware of the real reason why these Christians were persecuted. The majority of individuals that I know, that I have conversations with, they assume that the early Christians were persecuted simply because of their belief in Jesus. Now, why that is true, that rings true, that has a kernel of truth in it, is really more it's really more to it than that. It's deeper than that. That's sort of surface level. Most Christians, they present the narrative that because these Christians believed in Jesus and he called himself the King of the Jews, that the Romans persecuted him because they were basically influenced by the devil and the Antichrist, and Jesus had come to save the world. He came to die for the sins of the world, and the devil was on a rampage to smother out Christianity as it just began. And it's almost a supernatural reasoning that they apply to the persecution, when in all actuality there was a very reasonable, real world rationale to why these early Christians were punished. And when you look into history, and when you look into the historical record, and when you look into antiquity, you understand why the Romans persecuted Christians like they did. It really wasn't about them being possessed with the devil, and it wasn't about the Antichrist, and it wasn't about how Jesus had come to die for the sins of the world, so the devil was on a rampage to snuff out Christianity. There's a more realistic and real world explanation behind it. But the majority of individuals who I have these conversations with, they only read the narrative that's found in the Bible about the 1st century AD, the 1st century CE, when Jesus lived, and when Christianity is purported to have got its start. And they only read the Bible's account, or the documents that are in the Bible that we currently have today. They only read those accounts as to why this persecution took place. And I tell people all the time, if you want to understand why those Christians were actually persecuted, you have to look at history. You have to look at sources outside of... Now, where we're going to go to get most of our historical accounts about the 1st century AD or CE is we're going to look at the works of a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. Now, Josephus was born in around 37 AD, 37 CE. AD and CE means the same thing, so you may hear me use both terms throughout this video. So if the story of Jesus as we have it You know, we'll just take it at face value. If Jesus died somewhere around 33 to 40 AD, then we're looking at Josephus was born shortly after the death of Jesus, and he lived till somewhere around 100 AD or CE, somewhere around 100. He probably died shortly after that, or if he lived on, there was no more references of him, and he made no more works. The main works that we have from Josephus that remain until today, we have an autobiographical work called The Life of Flavius Josephus. We have The Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. We have The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. And we also have Against Apion by Josephus. So the one that we want to look at is The Wars of the Jews. Because when you look at the time period that Jesus is purported to have been born, there's two different accounts in the Bible. For one, in Matthew it says that he was born before the death of Herod, and in Mark, I believe it is Mark or Luke, it is said that he was, Luke I believe, it is said that he was born during the time of a census, which was after the death of Herod. So that's a completely different video. But what we're going to do is we're going to look into the historical record as left by Josephus in his Wars of the Jews to see exactly what was going on historically around the time of the birth of Jesus, to see if we can glean some type of insight on why the early Christians in the first century were persecuted. So what I propose is that what you have to understand is that in the first century CE, the Jewish people who are known in the historical record as the Judeans, depending on who you read, they're also called Jews, they're called Hebrews, they're called Israelites. All of these terms are basically synonymous. But in the area that we know of Israel today, it was basically called Judea in the first century. And the individuals living in that land were known as Judeans to the broader population. To themselves, yes, they were Israelites, they were Hebrews. To some individuals, they were Jews. But Jews come from the term Judean. Okay, so all of those are synonymous in the context that we're using it right now today. So what you have to understand is during the first century CE, the Judeans were a vassal kingdom under the foot of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was vast by this point. You had already had Julius Caesar, who came in the first century BCE, who turned Rome from a republic to a dictatorship. He was the first documented emperor of Rome, and after him you had the line of the Caesars, the emperors. So during the time of the first century CE, when Jesus is purported to have been born, Rome was no longer a republic. Rome was a dictatorship under the emperor Caesar, and not necessarily the first Caesar. It was the Caesar after him, known as Augustus. Okay, so what you have is the Judeans in the area of Judea revolted against Herod the Great, the Herod that's found in the Bible. The Judeans revolted against Herod, their king, and subsequently they ended up revolting against the Roman Empire. And there were a number of wars, there were a number of battles that the Romans and the Judeans fought against one another. In all actuality, Josephus, the historian who documents the wars of the Jews, he was actually a general in the Jewish army who fought against the Romans. So you have the population of Judeans during the time when they say Jesus was born. They were in active revolt against King Herod and against the Roman government. Now, some of these things unfolded over several years, and the battles became more intense, and the disdain for one another became more intense and became more palatable. But what eventually happened is, as you go further on into the timeline of Jesus's life, more and more revolts took place, even until you had it to the point to where multiple individuals were calling themselves the King of the Jews, not just Jesus. Multiple individuals were calling themselves the King of the Jews, and they were getting together bands of individuals, and they were revolting against the leadership in Judea that were vassals of the Roman Empire, and they were battling against Rome itself until eventually Rome crushed the Judean revolt. Right? They stomped out the Judean revolt. They destroyed the temple, the same temple that is spoken of in the New Testament. You guys are aware of how Jesus, he went into the temple and he turned over the tables of the money changers, and he proclaimed that you have turned my father's house into a den of thieves. Basically, that temple, where that scene took place, was an actual temple, the second temple that was built by Herod the Great. Okay, that temple was eventually destroyed in around 69 or 70 CE, while Vespasian was the emperor of Rome. He led that initial revolt that destroyed the temple. He was a general before becoming emperor, and his son Titus eventually finished up that work and decimated that temple. So what we're talking about is Rome was at war with the Judeans during the so-called time of Jesus. Okay, and there was an active revolt. And what you had in early Christianity, you had individuals converting not to Judaism, but converting to the ideology of who they claimed was a Jew and the rightful king of the Jews, who was opposing the rule of Caesar, not just Julius Caesar, but any one of the emperors who now took on the name of Caesar. And they were pledging their loyalty to this group of individuals who were in active revolt and who were at war with the Roman Empire. So you see the persecutions coming upon these Christians because of their allegiance to the enemies of Rome. They were pledging their allegiance to individuals who were actively revolting against the Roman Empire, killing Romans, killing other Jews who they felt were complicit with the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire subjugation of the Judean people. And so the early Christians were punished because they sided with the enemy at the time of war. This is where the persecutions came from, and this is what alarmed the Roman government. Here they are, they're putting down a revolt in one of their provinces known as Judea, and then you have Greeks and Romans and other Jews pledging their loyalty to a Jew. Okay, and in all essence making themselves enemies of the state. So it wasn't as innocent as Christians would like to believe. It was war. And so what we're going to do to try to prove some of this, we're going to go to Josephus, and we're going to look at what Josephus has to say about the time of Herod. Now, to give you a slight little backdrop, before Herod died, like I told you already, he had built the second temple, what was supposed to be the second temple of Solomon. And above the door to the temple, he had put a golden eagle. Now that eagle was the standard of Rome. They took this eagle into war with them, and they held it high, and it was a representation of the might of the Roman Empire. And the Jews, considering their laws about images and idols and things of that nature, the Jews saw this as a very, very, very negative thing, a blasphemous thing. They saw that it was a spit in the face of their God and of their laws, and a lot of this started with that Herod placing that eagle on the temple, and they removed this eagle from the temple, and a lot of this started. So So Josephus documents this in book 1 of the Wars of the Jews, chapter 32. Forgive me. In my book is page 48. Now Herod's distemper became more and more severe to him, and this because these his disorders fell upon him in his old age, and when he was in a melancholy condition, for he was already almost 70 years of age, and had been brought low by the calamities that happened to him about his children, whereby he had no pleasure in life, even when he was in health. The grief also that Antipater was still alive aggravated his disease, whom he resolved to put to death now, not at random, but as soon as he should be well again, and resolved to have him slain in a public manner. There also now happened to him, among his other calamities, a certain popular sedition. There were 2 men of learning in the city, Jerusalem, who were thought the most skillful in the laws of their country, and were on that account had in very great esteem all over the nation. They were the one Judas, the son of Sepphoris, and the other Matthias, the son of Margalus. There was a great concourse of the young men came to these men when they expounded the laws, and they got together every day a kind of an army of such as were growing up to be men. Now when these men were informed that the king was wearing away with melancholy and with a distemper, they dropped words to their acquaintance how it was now a very proper time to defend the cause of God, and to pull down what had been erected contrary to the laws of their country. For it was unlawful there should be any such thing in the temple as images or faces or the like representation of any animal whatsoever. Now the king had put up a golden eagle over the great gate of the temple, which these learned men exhorted them to cut down, and told them that if there should any danger arise, it was a glorious thing to die for the laws of their country, because that the soul was immortal, and that an eternal enjoyment of happiness did await such as died on that account. While the mean-spirited, and those that were not wise enough to show a right love of their souls, preferred death by a disease, before that which is the result of a virtuous behavior. At the same time that these men made this speech to the disciples, a rumor was spread abroad that the king was dying, which made the young men set about the work with greater boldness. They therefore let themselves down from the top of the temple with thick cords, and this at midday, and while a great number of people were in the temple, and cut down that golden eagle with axes. This was presently told to the king's captain of the temple, who came running with a great body of soldiers, and caught about 40 of the young men, and brought them to the king. And when he asked them, first of all, whether they had been so hardy as to cut down the golden eagle, they confessed that they had done so. And when he asked them by whose command they had done it, they replied, at the command of the law of their country. And when he further asked them how they could be so joyful when they were to be put to death, they replied, because they should enjoy greater happiness after they were dead. So what we see is the beginnings of the seditions, and we see the beginnings of the revolt. Now, this wasn't the first thing that King Herod had did that upset the Judeans, but this is happening towards the end of Herod's life. And if you remember in the biblical narrative, Jesus went and hid out in Egypt towards the end of Herod's life, and he stayed there until Herod was dead. So if Herod is about to die right here in the historical record, and the biblical account says that Jesus was in Egypt waiting for Herod to die, then this is happening around the same time that Jesus would have been a youth. So you see in the mythological account of Jesus's youth, right? You see the youthfulness of the revolt that led to the ultimate destruction of the temple. Okay, so I'm starting here because the chronology of it This is happening when the Bible says that Jesus is a child in Egypt. So we're right on point. We're right there at that moment in history when Jesus is supposed to have been born and been a child. We see this revolt starting. You know, you see them, the king is about to die, so they're feeling more emboldened. They feel that they can actually right some of the wrongs. He put this eagle on the temple and they're going to take it down. They feel more emboldened to take it down and actually right some of the wrongs of the wicked King Herod now. And so ultimately Herod had a lot of those individuals killed. And so as we all know, when things like that happen, violence begets violence. Okay, so they tore down the eagle from off the gate of the temple. Herod had a lot of them killed, and so retaliation is going to come. They are upset about that. And so in the same book, in the same chapter, it says, so Herod, having survived the slaughter of his son 5 days, died, having reigned 34 years, since he had caused Antigonus to be slain, and obtained his kingdom, but 37 years since he had been made king by the Romans. So we see the death of Herod happening shortly after this. So what you're going to see in the historical record is that the Judeans, now that Herod is dead, they're going to want retribution for the young men who were killed by Herod for doing what they appeared to be just. And just a sidebar, I want you to take note of the fact that those young men who took that eagle off of the gate of the temple were happy to die for following the laws of their country, which is reminiscent of the whole Christian martyr thing. Okay, the willingness to die for what one believes in, for the truth. You see this Christian concept of martyrdom and being willing to die for what's right, giving your life because what comes after is so much greater. You see the budding of it. You see the birth of it, the youth of it, the growing of it in the historical record, right when Jesus is supposed to be a youth in Egypt. That's very interesting. And so we go back to Josephus, book 2, chapter 1. He says, these Judeans, these lamented those that were put to death by Herod, because they had cut down the eagle that had been over the gate of the temple. Nor was this mourning of a private nature, but the lamentations. These lamented those that were put to death by Herod, because they had cut down the golden eagle that had been over the gate of the temple. Nor was this mourning of a private nature, but the lamentations were very great, the mourning solemn, and the weeping such as was loudly heard all over the city, as being for those men who had perished for the laws of their country and for the temple. They cried out that a punishment ought to be inflicted for these men upon those that were honored by Herod, and that in the first place the man whom he had made high priest should be deprived, and that it was fit to choose a person of greater piety and purity than he was. At these clamors, Archelaus, who was one of Herod's sons, who took over, was provoked, but restrained himself from taking vengeance on the authors. Okay, so what we're seeing now, and I want to tie this in now, Herod is dead. So in the biblical narrative, when Herod is dead, Jesus comes back from Egypt, and he comes back into his homeland, right? So in the historical record, when we're talking about the birth of this Christianity, we see that when Herod is dead, the people feel more emboldened, and this revolution comes on stronger in the land, and they demand that the individuals that were killed by Herod for defending the laws of their country be brought to justice. And not only that, the high priest that Herod instituted should be stripped of his title, and another high priest should be instituted. So now you see not only a revolt against Herod and his evil acts and a call for retribution, but you also see a revolt against his choice for high priest, saying that this man was filthy and dirty and he was not deserving to be of a high priest. So you see the searching for a new high priest who will morally uphold the laws of the land. Okay, now further on in that same chapter, it says, after which they betook themselves to their sacrifices, the Judeans, as if they had done no mischief. Nor did it appear to Archelaus that the multitude could be restrained without bloodshed. So he sent his whole army upon them, the footmen in great multitudes by the way of the city, and the horsemen by the way of the plain, who, falling upon them on the sudden as they were offering their sacrifices, destroyed about 3,000 of them. But the rest of the multitude were dispersed upon the adjoining mountains. These were followed by Archelaus's heralds, who commanded everyone to retire to their own homes, whither they all went and left the festival. So what happened was, after Herod died, his son Archelaus took control, basically. And the Judeans demanded that the people who supported Herod and who killed the individuals for taking the eagle off of the temple, they be punished. Now, this infuriated Archelaus, but he did not punish them immediately. And so what happened was, tempers flared more disrespectful things were said, more disrespectful things were done, and so it came to a head that while the Judeans were actually performing sacrifices, getting more and more rowdy, that Archelaus, he saw that this revolt, this seditious behavior, this attitude of we desire retribution would not be suppressed without bloodshed. And Josephus documents that he destroyed, he killed, he murdered about 3,000 Judeans in the midst of their sacrifices. And so again, this is going to cause more conflict. Now, mind you, this is after Herod died, so this is right during the time of Jesus. You're not going to get this in the Bible. Okay, but you're getting it here. Okay, and so now that he's killed like 3,000 of them, you're going to see that the revolution, the revolt, the rebellion is going to grow, and it's going to spill over from not only the Jews rebelling and revolting against Archelaus and the idea of Herod and the things that Herod put them through while he was king. You're going to see that they started revolting against the Romans too. They took it upon themselves to fight back against the Romans, and it started the course of actions which made anyone who agreed with this train of thought, which the Christians became, enemies of the state of Rome. And their persecutions came because of this revolt. This is the real reason that the Christians were persecuted. So we find in book 2 of the Wars of the Jews, okay, chapter 3. Now when that feast, which was observed after 7 weeks, in which the Jews called Pentecost, i.e. the 50th day, was at hand, its name being taken from the number of the days after the Passover, the people got together, but not on account of the accustomed divine worship, but of the indignation they had at the present state of affairs. Wherefore an immense multitude ran together out of Galilee, and Idumea, and Jericho, and Perea, that was beyond Jordan. But the people that naturally belonged to Judea itself were above the rest, both in number and in the alacrity of the men. So they distributed themselves into 3 parts and pitched their camps in 3 places. One at the north side of the temple, another at the south side by the hippodrome, and the third part were at the palace on the west. So they lay round about the Romans on every side and besieged them. So you can see around the time of Pentecost. The revolt has gone from Judeans revolting against the Judean rulership, and the Judean rulership really just being an extension of the Roman Empire, Roman rulership. They actually besieged Romans. Now Romans have been attacked by these Judeans. Romans have been killed. Romans have been brought into the fray. And anybody who knows anything about history, what do you think the Romans did, or desired to do, or planned to do, or would do after Romans are attacked? You know, Romans were known for their viciousness in war. You see, Rome was known to crush rebellions, crush revolts. They were known for war. This is how their empire grew. You attack the Romans, you better be ready for a fight. In the same book, The Wars of the Jews, in book number 2, chapter 4, at this time, there were great disturbances in the country, and that in many places. And the opportunity now offered itself, induced a great many to set up kings. And indeed, in Idumea, 2,000 of Herod's veteran soldiers got together and armed themselves and fought against those of the king's party. Stop. I'm going to read that again. At this time, there were great disturbances in the country, and that in many places, and the opportunity that now offered itself induced a great many to set up for kings. Was not Jesus known as the King of the Jews? Did not Jesus have his own following? His own disciples? And they're following with the narrative of the story. This is around the time when Jesus would have been an adult. But you see that it was not only Jesus who had a following. It was not only Jesus that was speaking against the Romans. You're going to see that it was several individuals, because this was a revolt of many people. And since the Judeans were displeased with the deceased Herod, displeased with who took over after Herod, displeased with the high priest, displeased with the Romans, this created a vacuum, a power vacuum. In individual groups, individual factions, individual thousands of men here, 1,000 men here, thousands of men here. They began to have their own leaders, and each one of these leaders called themselves the King of the Jews. It was not just Jesus. You may have had Jesus and his followers here, another man and his followers here, another man and his followers here, another man and his followers here. Now all of these individual groups with their individual leaders proclaiming to be the new King of the Jews, in rebellion against Archelaus, and in rebellion against the Roman government, and in rebellion against Herod, even though already dead. He was that iconic figure. What I want you to follow with the narrative, what I want you to see is these individuals are battling against the leadership in Judea. They're battling against the priesthood in Judea, and they're battling against the Roman Empire. All of the things that Jesus is said to have done. But he was not the only one doing this at that time. So what do you think the Romans would do to anyone who sided with any one of these factions? They had to put the faction down. Let's look at a couple of their names. In Sepphoris also, a city of Galilee, there was one Judas, the son of the arch-robber Hezekiah, who formerly overran the country and had been subdued by King Herod. This man got no small multitude together. And broke open the place where the royal armor was laid up, and armed those about him, and attacked those that were so earnest to gain the dominion. So you have this guy Judas, son of Hezekiah, who was the son of a revolutionary, because the revolutionary Hezekiah went against Herod, but he lost. But you have this son of a revolutionary named Judas, who in essence, broke into the armory, stole weapons, him and his group, and led an armed revolt. Jesus, now you have Judas, okay? In Perea, also, Simon, one of the servants to the king, relying upon the handsome appearance and tallness of his body, put a diadem upon his own head also. He also went about with a company of robbers that he had gotten together and burnt down the royal palace that was at Jericho and many other costly edifices besides. Now, a diadem, whenever you see pictures of Caesar and he have that like flower crown on his head, that is a diadem. Okay, so you see another guy in another place making himself to be the king of the Jews, leading a revolt. Okay, so now you got Jesus, you got Judas, and you also have Simon. Okay, now some of these same names are some of the same names of the disciples. Simon Peter, Peter is Simon Peter. Judas, we all know Judas turning back on Jesus. At this time, it was that a certain shepherd, never got a shepherd. At this time, it was that a certain shepherd ventured to set himself up for a king. He was called Anthragonus. It was his strength of body that made him expect such a dignity, as well as his soul, which despised death. And besides these qualifications, he had 4 brethren like himself. He put a troop of armed men under each of these his brethren, and made use of them as his generals and commanders, when he made his incursions, while he did himself act like a king, and meddled only with the more important affairs. And at this time, he put a diadem about his head. So that's just 3 accounts of individuals who upset with the rulership in Judea, upset with the priesthood in Judea, and upset with the Roman government, made themselves out to be kings of the Jews and led armed revolts around the same time that Jesus was gathering his followers. And it's clear that they put diadems around their head. Now, I want you to think about the crucifixion of Jesus for a second. When they put him on the cross and they put a crown of thorns on his head and they said, "This is the King of the Jews." That crown of thorns was symbolically the diadem. It was the diadem was the crown. So for them to put that on his head, they are telling you that this Jesus had put some type of diadem on his own head to make himself the king of the Jews. But it was not only him. Now, if Jesus is a myth or real, what I'm showing you is why, the real reason that Christians were persecuted. Because if you look at the historical record, and I tell you about this guy Simon, and I tell you about this guy Judas, and I tell you about this guy Anthragonus, and I say that there was a revolt going on in the land of Judea. They revolted against the king of Judea. They revolted against the high priest with arms. And they revolted against the Roman government. And then someone tells you that the Roman government massacred them and he hunted them down. And they said anybody who's a follower of Judas, anybody who's a follower of Simon, anybody who's a follower of Antigonus, we will find you and we will kill you. You wouldn't really be surprised. It makes sense. I'm not saying that it's right, but it makes sense. It's a war. You're fighting one another. Now, the story in the Bible, it kind of has us mixed up because it doesn't talk about Jesus as a he wasn't a fighting champion. He spoke peace and love and turn the other cheek, etc., etc., etc. But if you have all of these individuals talking about they're the king of the Jews, and it's all at this time, and they're going against the they're going against the king of Judea, they're going against the Caesar in Rome, and they're going against the high priest, and they're speaking all of these things, and their followers are making him out to be the king of the Jews. He sounds just like all of the rest. So what you see in the historical account, when the Christians were being persecuted, they were being asked, "Are you a Christian? Are you a follower of this guy who made himself to be the king of the Jews?" And if they said yes, they were boom. They were persecuted, they were beheaded, they were turned into martyrs. Why? Because he was looked upon as all of these other individuals. It only makes sense. This is the real reason. why the Christians were persecuted. This is the real reason why they were called a seditious group. This is what was going on. It was a revolution. Rome eventually sent Vespasian in to put down a revolt in Jerusalem. The temple was eventually destroyed. I mean, it was a big war. Thousands were killed on both sides. Rome won, but thousands were killed on both sides. But if you had individuals converting to Christianity and pledging loyalty to one of these kings of the Jews who were in active revolt against the Roman government, the Roman Empire, you see why, from a historical standpoint, these Christians had to be persecuted. And we know that they were persecuted because in Tacitus, right? Tacitus, a Roman historian who lived from around 56 CE to around 117 CE, born shortly after Josephus, right? 20 years after Jesus, give or take. In his Annals of Imperial Rome, okay, in the book that I have, he says, well, let me just give you Nero, during the time that Tacitus is writing about, Nero was the emperor of Rome at the time, and Nero was crazy, right? He had burned down a portion of the city, and he was looking for a scapegoat, and he blamed the Christians, is what they say. And Christians were persecuted. He blamed the Christians, which it could have been. I'm not saying it was. It probably wasn't. But if there was revolts going on, they were definitely burning down buildings, man. These Jews that were claiming to be the king of the Jews that was leading, they weren't all peaceful. They were killing people. They were burning down structures. They were unruly. It was a revolt, a rebellion, bloody. He said it was the Christians. It was the ones that say that they followed some guy named Christ. Let's get him. Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. But in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly suspicion had broken out afresh, not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. All degraded and shameful practices collect and flourish in the capital. First, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then, on their information, large numbers of others were condemned. Not so much for incendiarism as for their antisocial tendencies. Okay? So we do see that Christians were persecuted. But again, why? Because Christianity was formed in the era of a revolt. And Jesus appeared to be just like any other number of revolutionary leaders who are fighting against the status quo. And so when they said that they were Christians, they were basically saying that they were enemies of the state, regardless of how we want to paint it in today's with today's lenses, that they were peaceful, they were loving, they would turn the other cheek. It was a bloody revolt going on. Okay? Bloody revolt going on. Before I end this, I want to take you to the letters of the younger Pliny. Pliny was another historian in 1st century AD, Roman historian. He lived from around 61 CE to around 113. He was actually a good friend of Tacitus, and they actually wrote letters to each other back and forth. But what we're going to look at is Pliny's letter to the Emperor Trajan, okay, where he's basically asking Trajan for his advice on how to deal with Christians when he encountered them. And so I'm just going to read a little bit. Pliny says, "It is my custom to refer all my difficulties to you, sir, for no one is better able to resolve my doubts and to inform my ignorance. I have never been present at an examination of Christians. Consequently, I do not know the nature of the extent of the punishments usually meted out to them, nor the grounds for starting an investigation and how far it should be pressed. Nor am I at all sure whether any distinction should be made between them on the grounds of age, or if young people and adults should be treated alike. Whether a pardon ought to be granted to anyone retracting his beliefs, or if he has once professed Christianity, he shall gain nothing by renouncing it, and whether it is the mere name of Christian which is punishable, even if innocent of crime, or rather the crimes associated with the name. For the moment, this is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with the warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. And so he basically, and I may make a video about Pliny later, he basically goes on to say how he deems he should deal with Christians, and Trajan responds. But to the nature of the video, why, the real reason why the Christians were persecuted. I hope I've shed some historical light on that. It wasn't because of the Antichrist, and it wasn't because the devil was trying to smother out Christianity. It is because Christianity was formed during a time of bloody revolt, bloody wars, and Jesus fit the bill of several other Jewish leaders who had a following, who were against Herod, who were against Herod's successor, who were against the high priest, and who were against the Roman government. And so in that era of time, when they would be questioned, and it was like, oh, they got murdered just for saying they were Christian. Wow, what in the world? No. It was when they said, it's like now, if you have all of these different groups, and I hate to use this analogy because I don't want to, point fingers, but you have all of these different sects of what they now call radical Islam. Let's take ISIS, for instance. And regardless of what one says about the Quran, if you were to meet someone and they were to say, I am a member of ISIS, they're going to jail, right? They're going to jail. They're going to jail because of what ISIS represents. They say, I'm a member of Hezbollah. Or they say, I'm a follower of Osama bin Laden. If you just come out and say, I'm a follower of Osama bin Laden, people are going to think of 9/11, and you're going to be persecuted because of the history, right? So when they're coming up and saying, I'm a Christian, it's like, I'm ISIS. This is the historical reality that we're missing. So share this video, like this video, leave a comment, and I hope this sheds some light into why Christians were really persecuted from a historical perspective. Hotel.